if I'm an engineer, it's a challenge, but we like to do hard things, right, as humans. I want to engineer in a way that it's going to promote integral humanism and integral ecology.
Sister Damien Marie, thank you so much for carving out some time. You're the University of Notre Dame doing additional research. You're a fellow. You're incredibly busy. So I'm very grateful for your time.
Glad to be here.
Before we explore a lot of your great work, your great accolades, I'd love to go back a bit to find out a bit more of your origin story, as it were. For faith-wise, are you a cradle Catholic, a convert, a revert? Where did you fall in there as you grew up?
Well, I was born Catholic, and had the sacraments. But I guess I probably have to call myself a revert, to truly be honest, because when I went to, I think really through high school and part of college, I kind of drifted away from the faith. I wasn't exactly sure where I was headed with it. And actually, I would say it was probably my science that ended up being the impetus that brought me back, which is surprising for many people. Because they kind of associate.
It's quite surprising.
Yeah, yes. People will say, "Oh, is it because you went into science that you lost your faith?" But actually, it was the opposite. Because as I was studying science, and I was kind of so full of awe and wonder about how the natural world worked, I started to think, well, wait a minute. We can't design anything that even compares with these structures. So there must be something greater or someone greater. So that kind of kickstarted my process to revert back to the Catholic.
Yeah. Oh, and you said during high school, early university, which it's really interesting. I've had an opportunity to speak to several people, and that seems to be the very consistent time. For some, it's very dramatic, where they fell into a specific crowd. For others, they just declared they weren't going to church anymore. That was mine.
Yeah.
For yourself, are you able to kind of identify that sort of step back for that period between high school, early part of university?
Yeah. Well, I think part of it was, I had a desire for more depth in my life. And somehow the catechesis just wasn't cutting it. And I don't mean that to sound unduly critical. I guess mainly to emphasize the goodness of those efforts now that are kind of out there to reconstruct catechesis, and since John Paul II onward, to kind of revivify that. But I felt, I guess, through the confirmation process, I had questions that I didn't really feel were answered, and it kind of just led me to think, well, then the church isn't really where I need to be headed. So I think that was some of the question. Plus, you're surrounded by the culture, and it was feeding you many other messages, and some of them were fairly compelling, and you get other friendships and all of that, and it was kind of like, well, life is about relationships, and I put my friend relationships probably a little bit ahead of what any relationship with God. It just became, I guess, less relevant for me. So, and I didn't understand the teachings of the church, so that added to the whole mix, I guess, the whole cocktail.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you said about that culture, and being a teenager and putting your friends first, like, if that's not part of being a teenager, what is? So that's really it. It's interesting in the sense where there's a great similarity for a lot of people in the why you step away, but in how you refer to the step back in, I find that really interesting. I remember reading up about you, and it was specifically a botany class that really drew you in, and made you want to, you even switched your major, like for yourself in that moment, in that botany class? What was that pull like for you? If you're asking these questions, it's got to be pulling on something, not just necessarily that scientific engineering sort of inquisitiveness.
Yes, it definitely was something more than that. I think it was exciting. I mean, I was taking
Ah,
and education courses because I had always wanted to be a teacher, but I wasn't that thrilled with them. And I found myself thinking, well, maybe I could figure some of this out myself. But then there was a requirement to take this botany class, and I just found it so interesting. And I actually found out that I was good at it too, and which I hadn't really grown up thinking I was this, geeky scientist or anything. I'd always just kind of been a well-rounded. I was a good writer, and so anyway, I was just so excited about, and I had always loved nature. So this seemed like, wow, I can actually understand it. So there was some of that thrill of it. I think the beauty of science that grabbed me, and so I just thought, wow, I don't know even at the time if it was totally conscious. I just knew I was so drawn to it, and I remember I have to give my father some credit here because I called home thinking they weren't going to be too pleased with me about this idea of changing majors. And at the time, something like botany, I thought he was going to say, "What are you going to do with that?" And it's not very useful. But I explained the whole process to him, and he said, "Where is your heart?" And I said, "I think my heart is in this because I just love it." And he said, "Follow your heart, and I'm not worried about what you're going to do." And I love to repeat that because that was just a beautiful moment of fatherhood, I think, that he gifted me with. And that sort of just
yeah.
allowed me the freedom to just go for it. So,
That's beautiful. I'm newly married, and I hear these fatherhood moments. I'm, if God willing, I get to become one. I'm taking notes
yeah.
uh, of like these empowering words, and that's a beautiful sentiment, because sometimes parents, for the love of their child, might want to steer them to something that they deem safe, something where there's a utility, versus like it's like letting you fly and letting you flourish. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
And your studies, you really seem to really take to that, because you did your studies at McGill, and then you went to University of
Yeah.
Connecticut. I always think in terms of NCAA
Yeah.
basketball. You go to UConn, and then Catholic University of America, and there's this interesting mergence of science, engineering, and faith theology. In your following your heart, at what point did you realize you kind of wanted to combine these two major parts of yourself, and how did you come to that sort of conclusion?
Well, it started really at McGill, I would have to say. And I mean, I loved my education there. And the brother Andre was kind of intriguing to me. I was just exposed to him with living in Montreal, and I had some friends at the university who were, Catholic and engaged with those kinds of things. Although I wasn't really going to mass at the time. But I just found his story very compelling and very humble, and it just seemed something kind of counter to what I had experienced before. It added some depth to the church. Then I was part of a study abroad program at the end of my time at McGill, where we had to apply for it, and half of us were scientists and half were anthropology majors. And I was very interested in subarctic ecology, the ecology of the North. So the study abroad was to go to Finland, and those of us, there were 6 scientists and 6 anthropology majors, and the scientists would study the subarctic in Finland, and the anthropologists would study the Sami culture or the Lappish culture, but they go by Sami. And there was something about that human and natural ecology then that just clicked with me as I realized, I'm studying the science, but there's people who live here and have lived here for generations and have made this their home, and you can't separate the two. I mean, we have to for study, but somehow they should be coming together. So that was a beginning of this natural and human ecology need to be together. And I realized many times they're fighting with one another in many situations, and that's not what we want. So there was that. And then when I think being over in Europe, and I spent a little extra time while I was there traveling and met many young people. I stayed in hostels and all of that. And I realized, all over the world, we're all searching for something because you'd hear stories from people at night in the hostels. And I knew I was searching for something still, even though I loved the science, but I knew there was something more about my life. So when I got back to the States, I really started to think, what am I searching for? And then eventually, through a friend of mine, I met the sisters. And that started
Mm,
to bring me back to the faith first. And then, to my surprise,
mm.
to this discovery that I had a religious call. So,
Oh, regarding that religious call, was that something that you had thought of when you were a young girl or anything like that, or was this this time of growth? Was this just kind of almost out of left field for
it
you?
was pretty much out of left field. I mean, when you look back now, you realize, okay, maybe you had some kind of interior connection to God early on, but I don't think I ever identified it. I wasn't someone who said, "Oh, I want to be a sister when I grow up." I do remember
Mm.
loving the outdoors and being, I think I was about 7, and standing by the woods behind our home and thinking, when I grow up, I want to do something to help nature. And so I think that was probably the seeds of my Franciscan call, but I didn't identify it as that. So God
Hmm.
is He's a God of
Hmm.
surprises. That's what I would say.
Indeed, indeed. So I'm just trying to connect your academic growth to your faith growth. What were you studying at the time you began that discerning for the sisters?
I had come back from Europe, so I was finished with McGill, and I had started on my master's in soil science. But actually, I think I had met the sisters right about at the same time as starting on this master's in soil science.
Oh, okay.
And so the two and the sisters, our mother house is in Connecticut, and I grew up in Connecticut, so I had gone back there. So the two kind of came together at that time, and I would say the acceleration of the religious push kind of exceeded that of the science push at that time, even though I was working on my master's in soil science. But that's the religious call kind of really pushed me. But then in the
Hmm.
community, the sisters have always encouraged me to stay in science, so they've part
Oh,
of that.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so obviously your orders, the Franciscan Sisters of the Eucharist. For those who aren't familiar with your particular religious order, can you share a bit of the charism? Um, yeah, I guess a bit of the history if you can, and maybe share a little bit of during that discernment process how you found that right alignment, that right fit.
Yes, well, we are actually this year we're celebrating our 50th anniversary as a religious community. So we were founded in 1973, and we were sort of a break off from another community in the 1960s. There were a lot of changes in the church in the U.S. I'm not sure if it was the same in Canada, but um, and our community was kind of one of the fruits of those changes. And eventually, we started out as a subgroup in that community of the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration. And eventually, Rome had suggested you should become your own community, and they suggested we be called the Franciscan Sisters of the Eucharist. So we're a pontifical community, which means that we are free to have centers in many different dioceses. We always have the permission of the bishop before we do, but it does free us up. So we have, a house in Rome, in Assisi, in the Holy Land, And then our mother house is in Connecticut. I live at our house in Michigan. We have a house in Oregon and in Idaho, and then small houses in Florida, Vermont, Maine, and a small house in Vancouver, British Columbia. So, and we are professionally active, I would say, but we try to bring, I think the Franciscan element comes in several ways. First, we're always wearing our habit, and we try in our professions to bring Christ through our presence, through our Eucharistic presence to the people with whom we work, whether it's scientists. Or many of our sisters are marriage and family counselors. They work in the pro-life movement. Um, we have also home care and hospice care. But we have many of us who work out, so we go out into the culture like Francis did in his day, kind of a reform. The other thing, and this really attracted me, is that we live on our landed centers. We always have land, and even if we have a small center that's kind of a satellite, we usually end up doing some kind of gardening or something there. But we often have animals, so we, have chickens. In Michigan, we have our own steers, so it's our own meat. We have an orchard, so we grow a lot of our own fruit and vegetables. And we sisters do a lot of that physical work, so that the work is with the land is an integral part, I think, of our charism. And that was something that really attracted me early on, because I wasn't thinking of being a sister, but I really liked going and helping out with the work. There were other young people doing it. So I think that connection to the land, and it's kind of a pre-Eucharistic connection. So it's a very strong sacramental connection, and that's one way that we live out our Eucharistic dedication, of course, in addition to our prayer life. And then we have a strong community life too. So we live a very, very rigorous life together. We, do all our own cooking and canning and all of that, and then of course pray together regularly and are available to one another. We work on this, but we really try to be available to one another in a deep sense of Eucharistic relationships. So.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's pretty amazing. So as I continue to do more interviews, and the longer I become Catholic, so I'm a bit of a revert as of 4 years ago now, and it's always amazing. Thank you. It's always great to learn more about the different religious orders, the different spiritualities, all these great fruits and branches of the tree that is our faith. So it's great to learn about. The Franciscan Sisters, the Eucharist, and how you live out the charism, and also to get a better understanding of how or what attracted you to it. Just so if there's others who are watching this who are, you know, discerning the religious life, men or women, and just kind of getting that better sense of what they can sort of look for. So that's such a great summation that you gave. One thing I'm curious about is as you went on to do your master's in theology, and you did your PhD. What was that like for your faith? Like when you look back at yourself while you're at McGill, it was uh, secular institution and not active in your faith. Now you're in this whole new chapter where at this point you're in or in the midst of pursuing the religious order. Your faith is a fire, and you're in a Catholic institute. How did being in that sort of Catholic community help your faith flourish versus being in a secular institute? Not to say that you can't flourish, but just to speak on your own personal experience.
Yeah, that's a great question, I think. And so a couple of things I would say. Well, first of all, when I went to go on for my doctorate, our mother general, who was our foundress, had said, I'd like you to do a doctorate, but I suggest that you go to Catholic University of America. She said, but I want you to stay in the sciences, but I also want you, before you go on for your doctorate in the sciences or engineering, whatever you choose, I want you to do a master's in theology, because you really need the formal training in order to do this well. So I had this attraction that for me, it was a native thing. I didn't find this kind of clash between science and theology. I just didn't experience it. It to me, it made perfect sense that they kind of fit together, but I wasn't really able to articulate it. So it was a very exciting time. Well, and on top of that, my community was very generous and kind of gave me 5 years at Catholic U where I didn't have to work. So it became kind of, so I studied hard and I took a lot of classes. So I was working in that sense, but I didn't have to work to, help because we're self-supporting. Um, but it became almost, the study became almost prayer and the prayer study, so there was kind of a back and forth there. And I think you definitely need the formal training in theology to be able to engage well in this science and theology conversation. At the time, I didn't really know how much of a conversation I would end up engaging into later because my main focus had to be the science, but I was just trying to get a foundation. So I think also for those who might be interested in this kind of bridging ministry, you really have to be faithful to your science first, even while having the grounding in theology, because otherwise it's kind of a superficial conversation. So you have to get that solid training in the sciences. But then at Catholic U, it was like a whole new world because I just loved my theology courses there. And I also met people eventually in engineering. The dean of the engineering school was a strong Catholic, and he was very supportive of what I was doing. So I just felt kind of like, wow, I found this environment where I could do this, and I don't have to hide it. I don't have to sort of feel embarrassed about it, that I'm being supported in this. So I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if that.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess people, both secular and Catholic, don't necessarily realize of how prominent uh, Catholicism and science go together. Like even so far as I saw that you've spoken there at one point, the Society of Catholic
Yes.
Scientists. I hope I said that one
Yeah.
right. Like there's this rich tradition, and they go hand in hand, and that's also interesting. How you stated that if you're going to bridge the gap between faith and science, to be like firstly grounded more so in your science. So that's a good, it's a very good takeaway, because people from the outside definitely think it's the opposite. And maybe you could speak onto the importance of young Catholics or even older Catholics who are trying to bridge that gap, like why societies like that are so important, and why people like your dean are so important for someone's growth in both their faith and their work vocation.
Yeah, so the Society of Catholic Scientists is a wonderful organization. It's founded by Stephen Barr. He's a physicist, a Catholic physicist, and he wrote a book a way back now, but called Modern Physics and Ancient Faith. And I read that and was really intrigued. And to me, it just felt like I was coming home because his approach was putting words to what I had kind of always known. And because there's various kinds of writing in science and faith, but that was one that really clicked for me. Now I'm happy to say I know him, I know his wife, and it's a wonderful organization and has grown so fast. It's now international, and yeah, and in fact, last weekend they had another annual conference. I don't know if it's their seventh now or some. Don't quote me on that, but it's some. They've had multiple, and they take up different issues in science and faith in each conference, and they're very open to having theologians speak too, or to having some interdisciplinary talks at their conferences. So I think just an excellent group. So if there are young Catholic scientists, I always try to refer them to that group. I think it's a wonderful group. They can find mentors there because there's people from all different branches of science that are there, and there are
Hmm.
some of us who have agreed to be mentors or to speak on different topics if they want to invite someone to their university or something. So
Oh, that's
yeah.
great. That's great. Like I'm familiar with the organization. I've actually had a chance to speak and interview Dr. Stephen Barr quite some
Oh,
time ago
wonderful.
when I was still working full time at Salt and Light, and yeah, it's pretty amazing. I was reading a book that he wrote about materialism, and it was a really interesting sort of perspective of essentially we are more than our carbon and salt and all these no problem all these sort of things, and just that sort of physicist take on it. Well, it was like I come from much more of an arts background, and I do have a deep curiosity about things, but I was reading that book and like checking other things to make sense of it. But yeah, it's his work is great, and the organization is fantastic. I think it's super helpful for even if for non-science Catholics, just to, at the very least, if they encounter somebody who critiques them to, that our faith is not rational or something like that, they can like, well, okay, maybe this isn't my jam to talk to you about, but you can go here and talk to these people, like talk to the chemist, talk to the biologist, talk to the physicist, talk to the engineers. So a lot of great options with your work. Obviously you have been busy, but it seems that your level of work has really spiked and taken off once the Holy Father released Laudato Si, and it really strikes me as your work kind of come together in an encyclical. And actually that was my very first encyclical I read, um, as I reverted. And yeah, it just the idea of the moral spiritual challenges, care for the common home, it really seems to speak to your work. When that was initially released, what was your reaction? How did it impact both your faith and your work in that moment as you first kind of took that in?
Well, again, it was a kind of exhilaration. I was actually with Deacon Pedro Goveraman. We were filming.
On
Yeah, we were
creation.
filming the creation series,
Yeah, yeah.
and we were filming maybe it was the last episode. And he had said to me, "Okay, we're going to interview you tomorrow about the encyclical." And I said, "Well, it's a long encyclical and it hasn't come out yet." And he said, "Oh, we got a little bit of a pre-copy, so you can take a look at it tonight." So I literally was in this hotel room and I stayed up a good part of the night reading it. So I'll never forget that moment. And it was exhilarating because to see the church, I never expected that the church would come out with a document on caring for creation, and one that tied together. So, the first chapter has to do with all the science, right? And that's the entry point into the dialogue between the science and the theology. And then the second chapter is the theology. But then it goes into what needs to be happening inside of each of us in terms of ecological conversion and the human roots there. And then this proposal of integral ecology, which was what I wrote about in my dissertation, but I didn't call it integral ecology. I called it restoration of people in place, and used some of Bonaventure's theology in relationship with the science and engineering that I was doing. So I think it was just a great moment of love for the church, that we could put something together like this that I thought could speak to the whole world, not just Catholics, which is what the Pope says in there, and love for this trajectory that I think is a wonderful one for Catholics and for everyone to kind of. I just felt like the church is really putting itself to the service of the world with this, and we do that in the church in many ways. But this one hit me because it's so much in the area that I work in, and I
Yeah.
keep going deeper with it. There's so much in that document. So
Well, just hearing you when I asked you about discerning the religious life, and you didn't necessarily think of that when you were little, but you did know at 7 years old you wanted to do something with the environment. So that part of you that felt that at that age, like how did it react as you're going through and you're reading all these amazing uh yeah, just these amazing reflections of these things that you likely have held in your heart for quite some
yeah,
time.
it was just so integrating, and I think a kind of fulfillment, I guess. Just realizing, okay, you're on this path and you're on the right path, and just keep going and put yourself at the service of the church in this way. And I think thanking God, I just felt a great deal of gratitude, um, and gratitude because early on, I mean, even going into science was a little bit unusual as a sister. We have a few other scientists in our community, but not too many of us. And so I had always felt a little bit kind of not 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 in a negative way, but sort of on the edge, or doing something a little bit unusual. And this kind of made me realize, no, but you're going on the right path here, and this is, and it's coming back towards center. And there's just a huge, well, I know coming back into the church, if you'll just let me go back to that, one thing that convinced me in my reversion, I was doing a lot of reading and I didn't really know what theology was, but I was trying to read. And I had this real insight that, wow, the Catholic Church has been around for 2,000 years. And I'm reading things, from the patristic fathers that were shortly after Christ died and everything. And that stuff is still being read. So I thought, I don't know of any other organization that has been able to persist that long. There's got to be something to this. So I think that that was just sort of a logical thing. There's other heart stuff that happens for you, but that was something that just kind of clicked, like, don't discount the Catholic Church because it is the longest living. I had looked at different Protestant churches and all this. Then I was like, well, first of all, I was brought up in this, so maybe come home to that. But this church has been around from the beginning, and maybe don't discount it because there's a long tradition there. And so there was that moment when I was 7. Then there were, the moments at McGill where I just loved creation. And then there was the moments of coming back to the church and realizing, wait a minute, this church, it has a huge long tradition. So all of those kind of, it's just amazing that the building up of this conversion process, and then reading Laudato Si and realizing that 2,000 years are kind of put in here in different ways for everyone to read, and we're not afraid of that. We're offering it to the world, and there are some really good answers
Mhm.
in there, I would say. So I
Absolutely.
don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of it was.
Yeah. No, it really does, because it's almost serves as a bit of a retrospective. While we're in the moments, you know, we're we often, and I say we collectively Catholics, uh, that will ask God for answers, and we feel like we're going left and right, up and down, that nothing sort of makes sense, and that you're at times maybe floundering. And this is definitely part of my journey. But it's that moment when you look back and you see what you felt was all over the map, but then you see that straight line sort of trajectory when you keep your heart open for Christ, and listen for those whispers, which is the very difficult in a really loud
Yeah,
world that demands our attention. Uh, so to be able to take that time to look back, yeah, that makes perfect sense. And another thing that has been quite consistent with particularly reverts, is the three transcendentals, truth, goodness, and beauty. And it's always one of those three that seem to bring somebody back, or a mix thereof. Like for myself, I saw the goodness of my home church at the time, of opening up the doors for the homeless, for prostitutes, for drug users, drug dealers, to make sure people didn't freeze to death. And I was like, oh, this is what this love and action thing is. I finally get it. And this is in the midst of my RCIA. And for yours, it seems like a bit of a mix of, well, I guess all three, of seeing that truth within the mechanisms that make the world work, and the goodness of it and the beauty of it. So I've always found that very just very interesting, as each person has different measures of each to make sense of, well, why they are where they are.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And the fact that every
Yeah,
God
it's
has a
very.
call for each one of us, and it is a call that is true, good, and beautiful. I- and I think the tragedy is that so many people don't realize that they're loved that much, and that someone
Mm.
has laid that out for them. Not that it's easy to follow it, but they don't even realize it's there. And that's what I think those of us who have
Mhm.
found it do need to be joyful in that call and put it out there, you know, show people. And so you're doing that, like in the work that you do too, is very important. The media, of course. And
Oh, thank
yeah,
you. I've in as part of my journey, I literally, as in the midst of RCIA, and I literally asked myself, is there such a thing as Catholic media? And that actually got me down the road where I worked for Sultanite full time for a couple of years. I still freelance with them time to time, and I, and that's kind of what brought me to this is like it, there's just a lot of there's just a lot of beauty and there's a lot of goodness and a lot of truth in all the things that people are doing. And I my wife laughs. She's like, if I leave you anywhere, you're going to leave with a whole bunch of friends. Just I love people and I love learning from them, and I think everybody has a really interesting tale to share, and that's why I wanted to reach out to you, and I'm so grateful you accepted with how busy you are. Is It's so interesting to see somebody really live out the gospel, live out their purpose and their vocation in more sense than one, uh, being being part of the religious life and being a scientist and being you ended up living out that thing that you wanted to be as being a teacher, being an
yeah,
educator. So it's always interesting to see how things come full circle. And with your education with Laudato Si, I know you're out there speaking and sharing a lot. Something I've heard from time to time is not necessarily Catholic, some yes, where people they're trying to they want to push back against like the idea of like conservation or like being environmentally sound, and I guess what what can we say to that? Because sometimes I feel like it's a bit of hyperbole or self-serving where when they speak out against that stuff, but I don't have the PhD in environmental engineering, so
yeah,
I figure your words are much wiser than mine in this
yeah.
department.
Well, this is one of the sort of painful parts of this particular ministry, I guess. The Because Laudato Si, I mean, I was exhilarated by it. It received, I would say, a mixed reception in the United States, and I perhaps also in Canada. And it was exactly what you're describing. Those who are quotes, and I hate these terms, but just unfortunately they help explain us. Those who are quotes conservative Catholics just think, well, these are tree huggers over here, and they don't have any morals, and they're going to be pro-abortion. And those who are quotes more liberal Catholics think, oh, this is wonderful. We can't stand all that moralizing from the other side here. We don't have to do that. We can just do social justice things. And so there is unfortunately this underlying tension there, and that's one of the, it wasn't maybe so conscious, but one of the impetus behind the work I'm doing now at Notre Dame, which is writing a book on integral ecology, is to try and show people that the Catholic view actually is integrating. It is integral. And integral ecology means natural ecology and human ecology both flourishing. So, as Catholics who embrace this view, I mean, the summit of this is that, yes, I am pro life and pro creation, right? And if I'm an engineer, it's a challenge, but we like to do hard things, right, as humans. I want to engineer in a way that it's going to promote integral humanism and integral ecology and a healthy natural ecology. And there are ways to do it. So, and I think we need to present that as a pathway for Catholics, because right now they're just seeing kind of two polarized pathways. And I'm, and there are other people working in this area too. But I just feel like maybe my role is to present a pathway that shows, hey, you can be both. And this is truly the Catholic view. I mean, the Catholic view isn't either of those extremes, right? So if you love life, then you're going to love a human life. And there is something special, in ecology, we talk about niche. Every animal has a particular niche, which means there's a unique place in the ecosystem and unique function and location for each creature. And that means humans have a unique niche too. So we're not just the same as every other creature. There is something unique about us, and yet we are part of this whole system. So if we want to support the life in that system, it means supporting the human life too in a particular way. And that doesn't mean that we're going to be destroying natural ecology. It's how it has something to do with our own inner selves that has caused us to do that. Um, it's not that we're a disease. Well, I guess we have a kind of polluted inner ecology, and that's what needs to be restored if we really want to move into this integral ecology. So we can, we won't engineer our way into integral ecology. We can engineer in a different way to support that. But ultimately, we're going to have to change. We're going to have this ecological conversion that Pope Francis talks about. And so I try to use that perspective and also a positive perspective when I'm speaking to show positive cases, because we're in a kind of culture where we get a lot of negative narratives kind of hammering on us all the time. And I'm trying to show a unified and a pathway that's a real pathway if someone wants to be a faithful Catholic and also loves the outdoors, loves creation, and wants to support. It's an integral part of our faith. As Pope Francis, one of my favorite lines in Laudato Si is number 66, paragraph 66. We are to love God, love one another, and love the earth. He adds, we all know love God and love your neighbor, but loving the earth or caring for creation has been part of the tradition from the very beginning. It's in the scriptures, but he makes it really explicit in Laudato Si 66. And I think that's something I feel that we need to be reminded as Catholics that caring for creation is an integral part of our faith. And we have the Pope there saying it, so that adds some weight to it.
Yeah, that's that's a great way of putting it, and I really appreciate you pointing out when if Catholics are calling themselves conservative or calling themselves liberal, when in fact we should be reminded to just call ourselves Catholic and live accordingly, and being able to the work that you do is you bring it together. Like I can't wait for that book to help people learn ways in which to have that flourishing of self and the environment, and but particularly for those who are called to marriage, and we're called to make new Catholics. That's a really important thing for us to keep in mind, because like what are we leaving our children? So that's really really important. um, do you have an ETA for when your book is going to come out? I'm sure you're in the midst of
Yeah.
writing it, but I want
Well,
to mark a time on my
when you
calendar.
said you can't wait till the book comes out, I was thinking I can't wait till it comes out too. But so I'm here at Notre Dame until the end of December. And I'm really hoping that I will have a
Okay.
draft, well on its way. I'm more than halfway through now, so it's a little more than
Okay.
halfway through. So the first half of the book is kind of theoretical, like what actually is integral ecology. There's a lot of people talking about it, but I'm really trying to lay the foundations. And there's some Franciscan foundations there too, because Pope Francis dedicates the encyclical to St. Francis of Assisi. So I do try to expand those Franciscan foundations. Then the last half of the book will be more like, what does it look like in practice? So I'm looking for some case studies that might exemplify some of the principles that I'm highlighting in the book as being sort of integral to integral ecology. But, so,
Okay, that's great. Well, definitely we'll look forward. Definitely we'll look forward to it, and when it does release, I'll make sure it will update the notes in this video to make sure it reflects that, so people
oh,
will be
very
able
good.
to go get your book when it
Yeah,
comes out. So that'll be top of
yeah, thank
mind.
you.
Um, I know you've been quite generous with your time. But before you go, I'm curious to know if you can offer wisdom for Catholics who are, trying to find their way, trying to find how they could live out their faith and, live out the mission that God has for them. Can you offer any advice for them?
Yeah, a wonderful question, and we could talk for a long time about this, but I think a few things that come to mind. One is, and this was very important early in my process, and I thank my sisters for many things, and for this particular insight early on, where they explained to me that we don't create our own call, that God implants a call in everyone at the moment of conception, maybe before, but it's there, and what we have to do is uncover it and then spend our life living out that call. And I think a lot of people today are trying to create or make their own life or something rather than turning to the Lord with some contemplation and some time in prayer with the sacraments to hear what is that little voice saying to me. And when you find the call, the voice becomes pretty compelling. It's a little voice at first, but then it's like, well, if I don't do this, I'm really in trouble. You can feel that. So there's that. I think, and here's where I think also turning to creation, maybe to help hear the voice, because creation, so the patristic fathers, so 2,000 years ago, were very clear in saying that creation was a book, just like scripture is a book. They talked about the two books, the book of creation and the book of scripture. And both of them, the book of creation was like a first revelation, they called it. And it was the first revelation by which God was revealing himself. So in creation, we find God if we are open to that transcendent presence being there. It's not just all material, right? I mean, evolution did occur and everything else, but why do things self organize? Why? I mean, these bigger questions: why is there beauty? Why is everything oriented toward fertility and reproduction and all of that? That is the hand of God that's revealing himself in the created world. So if that might be a help for some young people because it's a little easier, maybe if they're not ready to go to church, go to creation and listen for God's voice in the created world, or work, do something to work in the garden or in the land, because somehow that will speak to you if you have an open spirit, because creation is constantly trying to communicate God to us. And I really firmly believe that. And I think that's one of the wonderful benefits that Laudato Si can bring to this. Now, you can't stay there in creation. So you have to allow it to first to come inside yourself and precipitate an inner conversion. And then it should also raise you up into the sacraments, into the sacramental life. If you follow the pathway fully, but the starting point is through the physical to the spiritual. So, and Saint Paul says this. Pope Benedict XVI emphasized this. It's through the physical to the spiritual. That's the sacramental life. So it doesn't hurt to go to the created world and listen for the voice of God there. So I think maybe those two things would be, well, maybe can I add one more? Um,
Absolutely, absolutely.
because I do find myself saying this more and more to young people: don't be afraid to take a risk. I think if I could just reiterate my father's advice, follow your heart. Because for whatever reason, there's kind of a fear pattern, and people think, well, I got to just do sort of the safe thing. And I think to take a risk, to listen to your heart and then jump for it. That's what youth is for, to jump for it. And if you have good mentors, wisdom figures, surround yourself with those, then you can be protected in some sense. But even if you quotes fail, that all, as long as you're trying to live into that calling, that pathway that God has for you, then you can't do it in sort of this measured way. You have to sort of embrace it all the way, take the risk, and follow your heart into that. So it's not just a mind thing. It's a real heart jump. So that's
Yeah, that's wonderful. And Yeah, that's great, and that's a testament to somebody I recently interviewed who's discerning. The Josephites realized that wasn't for him, and is continuing his discernment journey. That's not a failure. It's part of the process, part of the lesson. So I really appreciate you giving context and helping uh, helping. That's not just advice for young people, for sure. Help That's great advice for us all on how to find God's call for us. So Sister Damien Marie, thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to your book coming out. No pressure, no pressure, but really excited
Yeah,
for it.
thank you so much, Jermaine. It's lovely talking with you, and I will pray for you and your ministry also.
Thank you.